The iron bars were slick with ice, biting into the fur of the mother dog who had nothing left to give but her own body heat. Above her, a cardboard sign dangled from a fraying length of twine, the words "For Sale" scrawled in thick black marker, the ink bleeding at the edges as though even the letters were ashamed of what they said. She trembled. Her puppies pressed into her belly, their tiny ribs rising and falling in shallow, panicked rhythm. The city moved around them without a glance. Boots crunched past, conversations floated by, umbrellas tilted against the wind. Then the crowd parted, just for a moment, and a pair of small blue-gloved hands reached through the grey and touched the cold, rusted metal. What happened next will make you believe, all over again, that goodness has not left this world. Welcome to our channel. If this is your first time here, you've arrived at exactly the right moment, because our team is pushing for 1,000 subscribers this month. Be a part of our journey by subscribing for more thrilling stories. Rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments below, and tell us which part you loved the most when you're done with the story. Now let's dive deeper. Winter mornings in New York carry a particular kind of cruelty, not loud, not violent, but quiet and patient, the way cold always is when it means to stay. The snow from the night before had hardened into a fine crust along the sidewalk edges, and the bare trees lining the avenue wore their frost like something borrowed, something they had not asked for. Steam rose in pale columns from the street vents, curling upward and vanishing before it could decide what shape to take. The sky above was the color of old pewter, heavy and still, the kind of sky that makes the whole city feel temporarily abandoned, like the world had inhaled and had not yet let go. By 8:30, the avenue had already come alive with its own particular music. The clipped percussion of dress shoes, the soft thud of sneakers against wet pavement, shopping bags rustling in the cold, a food cart vendor somewhere ahead calling out in a voice roughened by years of early mornings. The city had its rhythm, fast, unapologetic, forward-leaning, and on a Saturday like this one, bundled in scarves and self-importance, it did not slow for anything it could not immediately name. Jessy wore her winter coat the way she wore most things, with her whole self. It was a bright, defiant blue, the kind of color that refuses to be swallowed by a gray morning, buttoned all the way to the collar and cinched at the waist in a way her mother had done twice already before they left their apartment. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with long blonde hair that had slipped free of its braid and now lay in soft strands against her cheeks, catching snowflakes the way spider silk catches dew. Her gloves matched the coat, deep blue, slightly too large, the fingers curling slightly inward at the tips, and she walked with her hands held open at her sides, the way children do when they are paying very close attention to the world and don't want to miss any part of it. People who knew Jessy tended to describe her the same way: she feels things too much. Her kindergarten teacher had written it in a report card as a gentle warning. Neighbors said it with a fond, slightly worried tilt of the head. Her mother said it in the evenings sometimes, quietly, to no one in particular. In the same breath, she used to say she is exactly like him. Jessy had grown up in the rooms of her mother's small veterinary clinic, where sick and frightened animals passed through in a steady, sorrowful parade, and she had never once learned to look away. The runt of a litter, a cat with a broken leg, a dog whose owner had surrendered him without ceremony and without backward glance. Jessy looked at every single one of them with the same full, unhurried attention, as if looking was itself a form of medicine. That Saturday she had not meant to be out at all. Her mother, Cleopatra, Dr. Cleopatra Adiz, veterinarian, widow, the woman who had been holding their small life together with both hands and a clenched jaw for the past 3 years, had an errand to run before the clinic opened. A supply order, a quick stop. Jessy had insisted on coming, as she always did, partly because she disliked being left behind and partly because she understood, in the wordless way children understand things, that her mother did not like the mornings alone. So they had walked from their building on West 74th Street, with their breath making small clouds ahead of them, Cleopatra's hand wrapped around Jessy's eyes moving across everything they passed, as though cataloguing the world for safekeeping. It was near the corner of Amsterdam Avenue that Jessy stopped walking. Her mother took 2 steps before she felt the pull of the small hand in hers go suddenly still and looked back. Jessy was standing on the sidewalk with her head slightly turned, the way an animal goes still when it has heard something no one else has heard yet. Her gaze had fixed on something set back slightly against the iron fence of a small tree bed, half hidden behind a drift of banked snow, easy to walk past, easy to dismiss. But Jessy had not walked past. Jessy never did. The cage was small and rusted along every seam, its bars so far gone to oxidation that the metal had turned from silver to a deep, sullen orange. It sat crookedly in the snow as though it had been set down in haste, and by someone who did not intend to return soon. Above it, tied to the lowest branch of the bare tree with a strip of packing tape, a flattened cardboard box had been fashioned into a sign. The letters "For Sale" were printed in heavy marker strokes, the ink thickened and warped by the damp, the words tilting downward at one end as if even they were growing tired. Inside the cage, a German shepherd mother had drawn herself into the tightest possible shape, shoulders curved inward, haunches pulled close, her body arranged not for comfort, but to cover the two small puppies tucked beneath her. Her fur, which might once have been glossy and rich in the light of a warm room, was dulled now by frost and exposure, the tan markings along her legs gone grey with cold. She was trembling continuously, not in spasms, but in that long, low vibration of a body that has been cold for too long and has stopped expecting warmth. People passed. A man in a wool overcoat stepped around the cage without looking down. A teenage boy glanced at it and kept moving, earbuds fixed, expression unchanged. A woman with a double stroller swerved wide and muttered something to herself, then was gone. The cage existed in the middle of the sidewalk, the way a potholder's noticed, inconvenient, and ultimately ignored. The city had developed a very practiced art of not seeing the things it had decided was someone else's problem. Jessy saw everything. She stood at the edge of the cage and looked at the mother dog with the same expression she wore when she stood at the window during rainstorms, something between grief and complete attention. There was no performance in it, no child's theatrical gasp. Her face had simply gone very quiet. She had seen this look before, this particular kind of tired. In the stray cat her mother had treated for free last January, in the old greyhound surrendered by a family moving abroad, and once, in the weeks following her father's funeral, in the bathroom mirror of their apartment when she had not known her mother was watching. It was the look of a living thing that has been left somewhere and has begun, very carefully, to make peace with the leaving. She crouched, the snow soaked through the knees of her jeans immediately, cold and sharp, but she didn't straighten or pull back. She lowered herself until her face was level with the cage bars, and then she reached out slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her, and pressed one blue-gloved hand flat against the rusted metal. Not grabbing, not pulling, just present. The mother dog's eyes moved to her. They were a deep amber brown, filmed with exhaustion, the whites shot through with red from the cold, and from whatever long nights had preceded this one. She did not growl. She did not flinch back. She watched the small girl with an ancient, patient wariness, the careful appraisal of a creature that has learned, through repetition, that human hands can mean many things, and that the only way to know which kind is to wait and see. "It's okay," Jessy said, barely above a whisper. "I see you." From 3 steps behind, Cleopatra stood with the supply bag hanging forgotten from one hand and watched her daughter kneel in the slush of a New York sidewalk, speaking softly through the bars of a rusted cage to a trembling dog and her puppies. She was 39 years old, a woman who had been through enough to develop a very reasonable set of rules about what she could and could not afford to take on, financially, emotionally, professionally. Her clinic ran on margins that kept her awake some nights. Her savings had not fully recovered. She had a waiting room full of appointments on Monday morning and a heart that had been working overtime since the day 3 years ago when she had stood at a graveside in the rain, and understood that she would be the only one holding things together from that point forward. She looked at her daughter's face, that particular total focus, that refusal to look away, and felt something shift in her chest like a door she had been leaning against finally giving way. She set the supply bag down on the sidewalk, pulled her coat tighter, and walked forward. Jessy did not move from where she was kneeling. The snow had soaked through the knees of her jeans by now, cold enough to ache, and a thin crust of slush had gathered along the toe of one boot. She didn't notice. Her full attention had settled on the cage the way water settles into the lowest available point, completely without remainder. One blue-gloved hand still rested against the bars, and through the thick wool she could feel, faintly, the cold radiating off the metal like a pulse. not warmth, its opposite. The kind of cold that means something has been here for a very long time, without anyone caring. The mother dog had not taken her eyes off Jessy. They regarded one another through the bars with the careful patience of two strangers who have arrived at the same difficult place by very different roads. The dog's amber gaze held no accusation, which was almost harder to bear than if it had. It held something quieter, something that looked, to Jessy, like a question that had been asked so many times it had stopped expecting an answer. The puppies were shifting beneath their mother's chest, now small, uncertain movements, the blind optimism of the very young. One had worked its nose free of her fur and pressed it to the cage floor, sniffing at the frozen metal with the touching confidence of a creature that has not yet learned to doubt the world. The other had barely moved, and Jessy watched its small ribcage for a long, private moment until she was satisfied it was still rising and falling. Both pups wore a fine layer of frost along their backs, their delicate guard hairs crystallized into something that would have been beautiful in another context, the kind of beautiful that only arrives in the wrong place and makes your chest hurt because of it. Jessy looked up at the sign. It was not a complicated thing, flattened cardboard, black marker, 2 words, but she was 7 and she could read, and she read them now with the same unhurried attention she gave everything, her lips moving slightly. For sale. She read them a second time, as though the meaning might shift on closer inspection, the way some words did when you sounded them out carefully. It didn't change. She looked at the mother dog, then at the puppies, then back at the sign. Something moved behind her eyes, not tears, not yet, more like the moment just before understanding arrives fully, when the mind has assembled all the pieces and is waiting for the terrible permission to put them together. Someone had put a price on them, on a mother using the last reserves of her own body heat to keep her children breathing, on 2 puppies who did not yet know that the world beyond these bars would ask them to be worth something to someone before it opened to them. Jessy had once overheard her mother on the phone describing a dog that had been returned to a breeder, returned, like a coat that didn't fit, and her mother had used a word Jessy had looked up afterward in the dictionary on her tablet, commodity, a thing valued only for what it can be sold for. She hadn't fully understood it then. She understood it now, kneeling in the snow on Amsterdam Avenue, reading a cardboard sign tied to a tree with packing tape. The city continued, without interruption, around this small, frozen tableau. A man in a long grey overcoat stepped around the cage with the fluid, practiced motion of someone navigating an obstacle rather than witnessing a scene. A young woman walking a small terrier crossed to the other side of the pavement without looking down, though her dog strained briefly at the leash, nose raised, ears forward, the animal knowing what the human had decided not to. 2 teenage boys passed, laughing at something on a shared phone screen, their sneakers loud on the packed snow, their laughter cutting cleanly through the cold air and disappearing just as quickly. The cage was visible to everyone and seen by almost no one. The city had perfected this particular skill over centuries, the ability to render suffering invisible through the simple act of collective agreement not to look. Jessy had never learned that skill. She had tried once or twice when the weight of looking became too much, when a stray arrived at her mother's clinic matted and terrified, and she had felt the full force of what that animal had endured, the way you feel a change in air pressure in your whole body at once. She had tried looking away. It hadn't worked. The image had simply moved inside her and stayed there, pressing against her ribs from the inside until she did something about it. She pressed her hand more firmly against the bar. The mother dog lowered her chin an inch, not submission, not quite trust, but the first tentative decrease in vigilance, the way a door that has been bolted for a long time will sometimes give just slightly when the right pressure is applied with the right intention. "Nobody's buying you," Jessy said softly, the words rising out of her with complete conviction, without preamble or rehearsal, the way true things often do in children before the world teaches them to edit themselves. "You're not for sale, you're a mom." Behind her, 3 steps back on the salted pavement, Cleopatra stood still, with her supply bag hanging from one hand and her other hand pressed flat against her sternum, as though she was checking to make sure her heart was still where she'd left it. It was, but it was doing something different than it had been doing that morning. There is a particular kind of poverty the world rarely discusses, not the poverty of money, though that was real and Cleopatra knew it intimately, but the poverty of being seen as a price before you are seen as a life. It happens to animals in cages on winter sidewalks. It happens to people, too, quietly and constantly, in the spaces between the moments that make the news. A child's refusal to accept it, expressed without strategy or vocabulary, spoken through a wool glove pressed against frozen iron, that is not innocence. That is something older, something the world spends a great deal of effort trying to educate out of us, and occasionally, mercifully, fails. Jessy did not know any of this yet in words, but she knew it in the way she was still kneeling, still present, still unwilling to leave. And that, for now, was enough to begin. Every year, thousands of animals are abandoned in winter months when breeding cycles end and profit margins narrow, discarded not out of cruelty born of passion, but out of the cold arithmetic of commerce. The for sale sign on a cage is not just a transaction, it is a philosophy, and the first rebellion against it is simply this: to stop, to look, to refuse to walk past. Cleopatra Adiz had a system for difficult things. It was not something she had designed consciously or could have explained to anyone if asked. It had assembled itself gradually over the 3 years since her husband's death, built from necessity the way all the best survival tools are not planned but grown. When something arrived that threatened to undo her, she would take a breath, locate the practical center of the problem, and move toward it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned that falling apart is a luxury she cannot schedule. It had worked, more or less. It had gotten her through the funeral arrangements, through the lease renegotiation on the clinic, through the months when the accounts were so thin she had taken to eating lunch at her desk to avoid the expense of anything warmer. It had worked on 100 Tuesday mornings when grief arrived without warning, and she had simply breathed through it and kept moving. It was not working now. She stood on the sidewalk with her supply bag in one hand and watched her daughter speak through the bars of a rusted cage to a dog who was quietly dying of cold, and felt the system fail her entirely. Not dramatically, no tears, no audible crack in her composure. Just a sudden, total uselessness, as though the part of her that managed things had looked at this particular scene and quietly put down its tools. She made herself walk forward. Kneeling beside Jessy, she assessed the cage with the trained eye she could never fully switch off, the professional reflex that had survived grief and exhaustion and everything else because it was, at this point, simply part of how she saw the world. The mother dog was hypothermic, or close to it. The trembling had the quality she recognized from clinic intakes, not reactive shivering but deep muscular vibration, the body borrowing from reserves it no longer had. The coat was dull in the particular way that indicated poor nutrition sustained over months, not days. The collar, thin nylon, the clasp rusted nearly through, had been on long enough to leave a worn track in the fur beneath it, a faint, permanent groove. This was not a dog who had wandered out in the cold overnight. This was a dog who had been maintained at minimum viable investment for a long time and then, when the calculation changed, simply left. The puppies were perhaps 8 weeks old, perhaps slightly less, old enough to be separated from their mother and sold individually, which told her something about why they were still here, still in the cage. They hadn't moved fast enough. The market had not materialized on the breeder's preferred timeline, and so they had been deposited here on a city sidewalk with a sign above them that turned the whole transaction into someone else's opportunity. Cleopatra sat back on her heels and looked at the sign. Then she looked at her daughter. Jessy had not acknowledged her mother's arrival with so much as a glance. Her focus remained absolute and undivided, her blue-gloved hands still flat against the bars, her voice a low, continuous murmur, not words now, just sound, the kind of sound her husband Tobiner used to make when he was coaxing a frightened animal into stillness in the back room of the clinic. He had been her veterinary partner before he was her husband, which meant Jessy had inherited that particular talent from both sides and had twice the reason to be impossible to redirect once she had decided something mattered. Cleopatra felt the familiar compound ache of grief and love that had become, over 3 years, a single sensation she could no longer separate into its parts. She did the accounting. She could not help it. The accounting had become involuntary, a background process running constantly beneath everything else. Emergency treatment for a hypothermic dog and 2 fragile puppies, blood work, warming protocols, IV fluids, monitoring through the night, follow-up, a conservative estimate. Not ruinous, not at a full-rate clinic, but she did not charge herself full rates, and the number still landed in her chest with the particular weight of something that will require moving other things to make room. The water bill was 3 weeks overdue. She had been rotating which expenses to defer with the concentration of someone managing a chess board that had too many pieces and not enough squares. And there was Jessy. Jessy, who had her father's hands wide across the palm, fingers slightly square at the tips, and her father's particular way of locating the thing in a room that most needed tending and moving toward it without hesitation or self-protection. Tobiner had died of a cardiac event on a Wednesday morning in March, 41 years old, in perfect visible health, with no warning and no farewell. He had simply been present, and then, between one breath and the next, had not been. Cleopatra had been the one to find him. She had not spoken of it to anyone in the detailed, interior way that might have constituted processing it, because there had been no time, and then the habit of not speaking of it had calcified, and now it lived somewhere beneath her sternum and occasionally pressed upward when she was not braced for it. Like now. Because Jessy was doing the thing Tobiner always did, the thing Cleopatra had loved and occasionally resented in him, the thing that said, without apology, I see suffering and I will not calculate the cost of responding to it before I respond. It was a beautiful way to be in the world. It was also an expensive one, and Tobiner was not here to help carry the expense anymore, which meant it was only Cleopatra and her underpaid clinic and her overdue water bill standing between her daughter's instinct and the cold arithmetic of what they could actually afford. She looked at the mother dog one more time. The dog looked back at her, and in that amber, exhausted gaze Cleopatra recognized something she had not expected and was not prepared for. Not an appeal exactly, not the performative sorrow of an animal that has learned to solicit sympathy, something more stripped down than that. The simple, dignified fact of a mother who had done everything in her power for her children and had now arrived at the outer edge of what her power could accomplish. She was not asking to be saved. She was simply still present, still doing the only job she had ever truly claimed as her own, with whatever she had left. Cleopatra breathed in slowly through her nose. The cold air hit the back of her throat, sharp and clarifying. She thought about the water bill. She thought about Tobiner. She thought about the version of herself that existed before loss had taught her to preemptively calculate everything she could not afford to lose. She thought about what it would cost, not in money, but in something harder to recover, to stand up right now, take Jessy's hand, and walk away from this cage. She reached out and placed her hand over her daughter's on the cold iron bar. Let me look at her, she said quietly, not a concession, not a decision made in haste or sentiment, a choice, clear-eyed, fully costed, made anyway. Move back a little and let me look at her properly. Jessy finally turned, and the expression on her daughter's face, the relief, the trust, the absolute and unconditional belief that her mother would do the right thing, was so unguarded and so complete that Cleopatra had to look away for a moment and study the middle distance until she was sure her own face had returned to something manageable. Then she turned back, unzipped the supply bag, and got to work. The hardest choices are rarely between good and evil. They are between what we can afford and what we cannot live with. Every day, ordinary people stand at the edge of someone else's suffering and make a calculation. What Cleopatra chose in that moment, to let her daughter's moral clarity cost her something real, is the choice that quietly changes everything. Not all rescues begin with resources. Some begin with a decision to stop letting the absence of them be a reason to do nothing. The cage did not want to move. That was the first thing Cleopatra understood when she gripped the sidebar with both hands and pulled a short, testing tug that accomplished nothing except confirming what she had already suspected from the look of it. The base of the cage had been sitting in the same spot long enough for the snow beneath it to melt slightly from the metal's own cold, then refreeze, bonding the rusted frame to the sidewalk in a thin but determined skin of ice. It was not heavy, it was adhered. There is a difference, and it matters, because weight can be overcome with effort, but adhesion requires something more precise. A particular angle, a particular patience, and Cleopatra was working with wool gloves, a narrow sidewalk, and a 7-year-old who was trying to help in the way that 7-year-olds help, which is to say with tremendous sincerity and inconsistent effect. "Don't pull the door," Cleopatra said, her voice low and even, the clinic voice, the tone she used when she needed a situation to stay calm and knew that tone was the first instrument. "If the latch gives with her against it, she'll panic. Come around to this side." Jessy repositioned without argument, which was itself a measure of how seriously she was taking this. She placed both hands on the side bar beside her mother's and waited, watching Cleopatra's face for the signal. The snow had been falling lightly since they left home that morning, but in the last few minutes it had changed its character entirely, thickening, accelerating, dropping now in dense clusters that landed on the shoulders and stuck there rather than sliding off. The kind of snow that means business. The avenue had taken on the hushed, slightly unreal quality that heavy snowfall gives a city, as though the volume of the world has been turned down by someone standing just off stage, and the people still moving through it were doing so with increasing speed and decreasing awareness of anything that was not their immediate destination. No one stopped. One man slowed his pace fractionally, tilting his head at the scene. A woman and small girl crouched over a cage on the sidewalk in thickening snow, and Cleopatra met his eyes with the direct, unembellished look she had learned to deploy over years of being a woman doing physically difficult things in public spaces. He moved on. She worked her fingers under the bottom frame of the cage, breaking the ice seal in sections. Working from one corner toward the center the way you peel something that is stuck rather than simply lift it. The cold came through the wool immediately, not gradually, a sharp, immediate bite that moved from her fingertips to her palms in under a minute. She kept working. Inside the cage, Mandy had gone very still in the way animals go still when they understand that something significant is happening and have chosen, consciously or otherwise, to allow it. The puppies were awake now, both of them, their small dark eyes bright and watchful above their mother's foreleg. The ice released with a sound like a word being unsaid, a soft, definitive crack followed by the sensation of the cage lifting cleanly. Not heavy, 8 kilograms, perhaps 10 with the dogs inside. Under other circumstances, a manageable load. On an icy sidewalk in escalating snow, carrying a trembling mother and her puppies while trying to keep the whole thing level enough that nobody inside was thrown against the bars. It was a different proposition. "Hold your side steady," Cleopatra said. "Don't let it tip toward you." "I know," Jessy said, with the mild dignity of someone who has been underestimated. They moved in increments. A step, then a pause to rebalance. Another step, then an adjustment as Jessy's boot slipped on a patch of black ice beneath the snow, and she caught herself without dropping her side, which Cleopatra noted and did not comment on, because commenting on it would make it a bigger moment than the situation had room for right now. The clinic was 11 blocks away. They had no car. They had one supply bag, 2 sets of wool gloves, and the particular stubborn momentum of people who have already committed. 4 blocks in, Cleopatra's arms had begun to tremble, not from the weight, but from the sustained effort of keeping the cage perfectly level, which required a constant, isometric tension in both shoulders. She did not say this. She shifted her grip, redistributed the load, and kept walking. Ahead of them, the avenue stretched through the snow, the brownstone fronts softened to pale shapes, the traffic lights blurred to orange and red smears, the ordinary geography of the neighborhood turned briefly abstract by weather. Behind them, 2 sets of boot prints filled in steadily as the snow came down. Inside the cage, Mandy had lowered her chin onto the fur of the nearest puppy. She was still trembling, but the pitch of it had changed almost imperceptibly, less the vibration of a body beyond its limits, more the trembling of a creature trying to decide whether it can afford to hope. Jessy noticed it. She did not say anything about it to her mother, but her grip on the cage bar tightened slightly, and she stood fractionally straighter. 3 more blocks, then 2. The snow was coming horizontally now, carried on a wind that had found the corridor between buildings and was moving through it with efficient cruelty, pushing against them, as though it had an opinion about the direction they were headed. Cleopatra's eyes watered, which was the cold and not anything else, and she blinked it clear and kept her focus on the sidewalk immediately ahead, the next square of pavement, then the next. She had learned to do this in the months after Tobana died, when the full distance between where she was and where she needed to eventually get to was too large to hold in the mind without being flattened by it. You did not look at the whole road. You looked at what was directly beneath your feet, and you lifted them, and you placed them forward, and then you did it again. 1 block from the clinic, Jessy said, quietly and without drama, "She's looking at me." Cleopatra glanced sideways without slowing. Inside the cage, Mandy's amber eyes were fixed on Jessy's face with an expression that, in an animal from a veterinarian with 17 years of practice, she could only describe as deliberate. Not the glassy, absent look of an animal shutting down, not the wild, unfocused fear of one about to bolt. This was attention, chosen, directed, sustained. A dog that had been abandoned on a public street by the person most obligated to protect her, who had spent hours watching the indifferent city move around her like water around a stone, was looking at a 7-year-old girl with something that could not be responsibly called anything other than recognition. Cleopatra swallowed, looked ahead, said nothing. They turned the last corner into the short side street, where the clinic occupied the ground floor of a narrow brownstone, the painted sign above the door, Adie's Veterinary Care, barely legible through the snow. Cleopatra shifted the cage to one arm, fished her keys from her coat pocket with hands that were now almost completely numb, and had the door open in 10 seconds. Warm air hit them like a wall, dense, with the particular smell of the clinic, antiseptic and animal warmth, and something faintly herbal that had never entirely left the walls. They set the cage down on the intake floor. For a moment, none of them moved, mother, daughter, dog, puppies, all 4 suspended in the abrupt stillness after sustained effort, the sudden silence of indoors after weather. Then one of the puppies made a sound, high and searching, and Mandy turned to it immediately, and Jessy made a sound of her own that was somewhere between relief and grief, and Cleopatra straightened up and went to wash her hands, because if she allowed herself a moment she would use it badly. Outside, the snow continued falling on an empty stretch of sidewalk, where a rusted cage no longer sat. Somewhere in this city, the person who left that cage on the pavement went about his day undisturbed. He did not worry about the weather. He did not think about the mother dog or her puppies. He relied, as people like him always do, on the assumption that no one would care enough to act. Every time someone walks past without stopping, that assumption is confirmed. Every time someone doesn't, it isn't. The man who left them there thrives on your silence. Are you siding with his greed, or will you hit the like button to show you stand for the voiceless? Cleopatra worked in silence for the first several minutes, which was how she always worked when the situation was serious enough to require her full interior attention, and she could not afford to divide it. The intake table was a stainless steel surface beneath a bank of warm overhead lights, and under those lights, Mandy looked both better and worse than she had on the street. Better because the frost was melting from her coat, and the trembling had already begun to subside in the sustained warmth of the room. Worse because the light was honest in the way that outdoor light in winter never quite is, and what it revealed was a history written in the body. Jessy sat on the low bench along the wall with both hands pressed between her knees, watching with the focused, slightly held breath attention of someone who wants very much to ask questions and has understood that now is not the time. The puppies had been lifted carefully from the cage and placed in a lined warming box on the counter, Cleopatra's hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who has performed this particular gesture hundreds of times, gently, quickly, without fuss. They were both responsive, both vocalizing, both, in the assessment of 17 years of practice, going to be fine with warmth and food and time. It was the mother that required the longer look. Cleopatra ran her hands along Mandy's spine and felt what she expected to feel, the vertebrae too prominent, the muscle mass too diminished, the coat shedding in the uneven pattern that speaks not of seasonal change, but of sustained nutritional deficit. She checked the teeth. She checked the eyes. She palpated the abdomen with careful, methodical pressure, and when she reached the lower quadrant, Her hands paused for just a moment before continuing, which was a gesture invisible to Jessy, but legible to anyone who had spent enough time reading the language of a veterinarian encountering something that confirms a suspicion they had not wanted confirmed. She had seen this before, not this specific dog, the condition. The clinical term was overbreeding, though the term itself was almost too clean for what it described, too administrative, too distant from the reality of a body that had been used as a reproductive instrument beyond any reasonable biological limit, cycled through litter after litter with insufficient recovery between them, with minimal nutrition beyond what was required to sustain the bare mechanics of production. It was not rare. That was the thing she always had to stop herself from saying aloud in certain company because it sounded like resignation, and she did not feel resigned. She felt, each time, the same contained fury she had felt the first time, which she maintained carefully because it was useful, and because the alternative was despair, and despair had no instruments. She straightened and peeled off the first pair of gloves. Outside the clinic's front window, the snow was still coming down. The street was nearly empty now, the few pedestrians moving with the hunched, purposeful speed of people intent on being somewhere else. It was an ordinary Saturday in February in a large city, and in that city, and in cities like it across the country and across the continent, and in every geography where winter arrives with economic consequences for those who treat living creatures as seasonal product. In all of those places, on that same Saturday, animals were being left in the cold. Not dramatically, not, for the most part, with any particular feeling. That was the part that was hardest to sit with, not that cruelty required passion, but that it so often required almost nothing at all. A decision made in a car before the door opened. A calculation completed before a cage was unloaded. The math of a market in which a litter of German Shepherd puppies that had not sold by a certain date became a liability rather than an asset, and liabilities were discharged in the most expedient manner available. A cardboard sign, a sidewalk, a winter morning, done. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals estimates that in the United States alone, somewhere between 6 and 8 million animals enter shelters every single year. In the colder months, the intake numbers rise, not because people become suddenly crueler in winter, but because the economics of certain breeding operations reach their natural conclusion as holiday demand drops off and carrying costs accumulate. Puppies that were projected to sell in December and did not become February's problem, and February's problem has a solution that costs nothing except whatever the person applying it happens to possess in the way of a conscience. Some are surrendered to shelters. Some are abandoned in places where someone else will find them and feel obligated to act. Some are not found. These are not exceptional operations. They are not the work of visible monsters. They are, overwhelmingly, the work of ordinary commercial logic applied to living creatures, the entirely predictable result of a system that classifies animals as property, assigns them a market value, and then loses interest when the value drops. It is an industry sustained not primarily by the people operating within it, but by the people purchasing from it without question, and by the larger, ambient agreement of the public not to examine it too closely. Cleopatra thought about all of this, as she often did during the intake portion of a case that had arrived this way, not as a distraction from the work, but as a companion to it, the way you think about a war while tending the wounded. It did not slow her hands. It did not soften the edges of what she was doing. It simply lived alongside the work, informing the particular quality of her attention. She thought about the word profitable. It was the word she always returned to in these cases, because it was the hinge on which everything else swung. Not evil, not sadism, not even indifference in its purest form, profitable. An animal is bred when it is profitable. It is housed minimally when that housing is profitable. It is abandoned when maintaining it is no longer profitable, and the winter is an especially efficient auditor of profitability because it raises carrying costs and simultaneously depresses casual foot traffic and impulse purchasing, and the animals caught in that particular economic vice have no mechanism for understanding that their circumstances are not personal, that it is not about them, that they have simply been unfortunate enough to exist inside a system that was never designed with their survival as a primary concern. Mandy did not know any of this. She lay on the intake table in the growing warmth and let Cleopatra's hands move over her with the same careful, watchful patience she had demonstrated on the sidewalk, neither fully surrendered nor braced for harm, occupying the uncertain middle ground of a creature that has learned to wait and see. Occasionally her gaze moved to the warming box where her puppies were beginning to make stronger, more insistent sounds, and at those sounds something in her expression shifted, a quickening, a precision of focus, the mother underneath the patient, underneath the exhausted, underneath everything that had been done to her, still entirely present and entirely operational. It was the most quietly devastating and the most quietly magnificent thing Cleopatra had seen in recent memory, and she had seen a great deal. Jessy from the bench said, "Is she going to be okay?" Cleopatra considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which is to say, she did not answer immediately with reassurance, because her daughter had always been able to tell the difference between an honest answer and a comforting one, and had always, with polite precision, preferred the honest one. "She's going to need a lot," she said, "but she has a lot to recover for." She glanced at the warming box, where the puppies were now audible enough to be heard clearly across the room. That helps. With dogs, with people, having something to recover for makes the body work harder. I've seen it enough times to believe it. Jessy considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she nodded, a single slow dip of her chin, as though accepting a term she intended to hold someone to. Greed, Cleopatra had once heard a colleague say, is not a fire. It does not announce itself with smoke and heat and the alarm of something visibly burning. It is a frost. It moves quietly in the night, through the spaces between things, lowering the temperature of everything it touches so gradually that by the time you feel it the damage is already done. Animals in winter cages, a cardboard sign, a calculation made in a warm car before a door was opened. The warmth of the clinic pressed back against it steadily, unremarkably, a small, lit room doing the work it was built to do. Outside, the snow kept falling on an empty sidewalk. Hundreds of thousands of animals are abandoned every winter in the United States alone, not by monsters, but by markets. The system that enables this runs on two fuels, profit and silence. Profit, we cannot always disrupt. Silence, we can. Share this story with one person today who doesn't know this is happening, because the first thing that changes any broken system is always the same, enough people refusing to look away. Cleopatra heard it before she saw it. The engine had a particular quality, low, deliberate, too slow for traffic, and too persistent for someone simply looking for parking. It passed the clinic window once while she was still on hold with the animal welfare unit, and she registered it the way you register something at the edge of attention without yet bringing it to the center. A dark shape in the peripheral vision, a sound that didn't quite fit the rhythm of the street. She filed it and moved on, because she was on hold and Mandy needed a second round of vitals and the puppies needed feeding, and her capacity for simultaneous concern was finite. The second pass brought her to the window. It was a black SUV, large, late model, the kind of vehicle that is unremarkable in this part of the city in the way that expensive, anonymous things are unremarkable when there are enough of them. It was moving at perhaps 10 kilometers an hour through the residual slush, which was slow enough to be intentional and fast enough to deny intention if challenged. The windows were tinted to the legal limit and possibly beyond. As she watched, it reached the end of the block, paused at the corner for slightly longer than the intersection required, and turned, not onto the avenue, but back around the side street, completing a circuit. She stepped back from the window before she had consciously decided to. The animal welfare line connected at that moment, and she had the presence of mind to keep her voice level and businesslike as she reported what she had found: the tattoo number, the intake log entries, the pattern across months and apparent locations. The officer on the other end was professional and unhurried, in the manner of someone managing a large caseload, asked 4 clarifying questions, took the tattoo number, and told her someone would follow up within 48 hours. She thanked him and ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, looking at the window from across the room. 48 hours. She went to the window again, standing to one side of it this time rather than in front, which she noted was a change in her own behavior that she did not entirely like. The SUV was at the far end of the block, barely visible through the residual snow haze, idling. From this distance and through tinted glass she could see nothing of the interior. But idling meant occupied, and occupied meant waiting, and waiting on a block that contained, at this particular moment, a dog whose ear tattoo traced back to a breeding operation that had just been reported to an investigative authority. That specific coincidence had the quality of something that was not a coincidence. She thought about the cage, about the way it had been placed, not haphazardly, but positioned against the fence at a specific tree on a specific block, accessible, visible, still technically retrievable. A deposit, not an abandonment. Something left with the expectation that it could be reclaimed if the sale did not materialize elsewhere. Her jaw tightened. Jessy stirred on the bench, shifted, resettled without fully waking. Her blonde hair had fallen forward across her face, and her lips were slightly parted, and she looked, in sleep, like something that needed protecting in the most fundamental and non-negotiable way. The way the word child means before it means anything else. On the intake table, Mandy lifted her head. It was not a dramatic movement, just the quiet, precise elevation of attention that a German shepherd performs when something in the surrounding environment has changed in a way that warrants monitoring. Her ears, which had been relaxed against her head in the warmth of the room, rose and angled, not toward the window, but toward the door, toward the street-side wall, in the direction of an engine she had no reason to recognize and every instinct to distrust. Cleopatra watched the dog and felt the hair on her own forearms lift beneath her sweater. She crossed to the door and turned both locks, the handle lock and the deadbolt above it, which she normally only engaged after closing hours. The sound of the bolt sliding home was quiet and solid and final. Then she pulled the cord on the front blind, dropping it in a single, unhurried motion, and the window went dark. She stood in the now-closed room and listened. The SUV made a third pass. She could hear it through the wall, that same low, deliberate engine, unhurried, confident in the way that things are confident when they have not yet been seriously opposed. It slowed near the front of the clinic, or she believed it did. Sound was difficult to localize precisely through brick and insulation and the ambient noise of a city afternoon, but her body was operating on a frequency below rational interpretation, and it was telling her clearly that the slow point was here, was this building, was this door. Then it moved on. She counted to 60 after the sound faded, before she allowed herself to release the breath she had been managing rather than fully taking. Then she went back to the intake table, ran her hand once along Mandy's flank, a gesture meant as steadying, though she was not entirely sure which of them she was steadying, and began preparing the evening feeding for the puppies. She did not pull the blind back up. People who exploit animals for profit do not stop when the immediate transaction fails. They circle back. They look for their property, and in their minds, that is precisely what these animals are. The only thing that disrupts this certainty is visibility, documented evidence, formal reports, and communities that refuse to be silent. The breeder thinks he can scare us into staying quiet. Prove him wrong. Comment "Justice for Mandy" below and share this story to warn others about these operations in your community. Your voice is the one thing they cannot repossess. He did not knock. That was the first thing, the absence of a knock, which communicated everything he intended it to communicate. The door handle moved instead, a single firm depression that met the resistance of the deadbolt and stopped there, and in the half-second of silence that followed, Cleopatra understood that the locked door had not discouraged him so much as informed him that someone inside was aware and had prepared, which meant the next move would be a different kind of force. The knock, when it came, was not a request. 3 heavy impacts, knuckles against the door frame, with the specific cadence of someone who has used this knock before and knows what it produces in people: a startle, a reflex toward compliance, the instinct to open a door when it is struck with sufficient authority. Cleopatra stood in the center of the room and did not move toward it. Jessy was awake now, fully, sitting upright on the bench with her eyes wide and her hands gripped together in her lap. The puppies had gone silent in the warming box. Mandy, on the intake table, had raised herself from her resting position to sitting slowly, and at a cost that was visible in the tremor of her forelegs, but fully upright, her ears precisely forward, her attention directed at the door with an unwavering focus that made the room feel suddenly organized around a single point. "Open up, those dogs are my property." The voice was flat and without particular heat, which made it worse rather than better. Anger, at least, implied a person partially out of control. This had the temperature of a transaction, the voice of someone who regarded this inconvenience as correctable and was prepared to correct it with whatever was required. Cleopatra picked up her phone, kept her voice level. "This clinic is closed. Any animal welfare inquiries should be directed to." "Lady," a pause freighted with the particular patience of a person reminding themselves to remain efficient. "I'm not making an inquiry. Open the door or I open it myself." The handle moved again, then a shoulder, she heard it, the soft but deliberate pressure against the door frame, testing the deadbolt's tolerance, testing hers. What happened next she would describe afterward in the sparse, sequential language she used for incident reports, because it was the only register she had available for something she had not fully processed. Mandy got down from the table. Not fell, not slid, got down with the complete, considered intention of a dog that has assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion about her role in it. The movement cost her. The foreleg tremor deepened when she landed, and she stood for a moment absorbing the impact, head lowered slightly, sides expanding and contracting with the elevated breath of exertion. Then she raised her head, turned from the table, and walked steadily, unhurriedly, with a gait that was diminished but not uncertain, to the place directly in front of the door. She stood there and faced it. Not barking, not performing threat in any of the theatrical ways that fear sometimes produces. Simply present, positioned, her body placed with exact deliberateness in the narrow corridor of space between the door and the bench where Jessy sat, between the thing attempting to enter and the child she had decided, in whatever calculus a dog uses for such decisions, was worth standing in front of. Jessy made a small, involuntary sound, not fear, not quite, something more compound than fear. Cleopatra dialed, not the animal welfare unit this time, that number was for 48 hours from now, and this was happening in the present tense. She dialed 911, and when the operator answered she spoke in the clear, unhurried voice she used for emergencies, which was the same voice she used for everything, because she had long ago learned that panic was least useful precisely when it was most available. She gave the address. She described the vehicle, black SUV, partial plate she had memorized during the third pass without knowing she was memorizing it. She described the man's words. She kept her eyes on the door. Mandy had not moved. The pressure against the door frame had stopped. There was a silence of perhaps 30 seconds, a silence with weight and texture, a silence that was itself a form of calculation, and then the sound of footsteps on the front step, retreating, not running, walking, measured and deliberate, the way a man walks when he wants it known that he is leaving by choice and not by flight. The engine started at the curb, idled for 10 seconds, pulled away. The room held its held breath for one long moment after the sound faded, and then Mandy turned from the door. She looked at Jessy with the same direct, unhurried attention she had given the vehicle and its occupant, only different in quality, the vigilance replaced by something quieter, something that belonged to a different register entirely. Then, with the careful, deliberate movement of a body that has done what it came to do and may now rest, she walked back to the intake table, placed her forepaws on the edge, and looked back at Cleopatra with an expression that communicated, as plainly as expression communicates anything, that she required assistance getting back up. Cleopatra lifted her, both arms, gently, the way you carry something you have understood the full value of only recently. Jessy was off the bench before the dog was settled, her arms around her mother's waist from behind, her face pressed between Cleopatra's shoulder blades, not saying anything. Cleopatra stood still and let it happen. Outside, a police siren somewhere on the avenue was growing closer. The warming box hummed. The blind remained drawn against the grey afternoon light. A dog who had been abandoned, overbred, frozen, and left on a public street as disposable inventory had just placed herself, on her own terms, between a predator and a child. She had done it without hesitation, without calculation, without any apparent consideration of the cost to herself. She had done it because it was simply, completely, the only thing worth doing. Loyalty of that quality is not trained. It cannot be purchased, commodified, or reclaimed by anyone who has forfeited the right to it. What Mandy demonstrated in that room, protection offered freely from a place of profound physical vulnerability for someone who had shown her only kindness, is the thing that no breeder's ledger has ever found a column for. Some things cannot be priced. The tragedy is how long it takes the world to remember that. The grace is that animals like Mandy never forget it. The police arrived first, then the story got out the way stories do in neighborhoods that are smaller than they appear from the outside, not through any single announcement, but through the permeable walls of adjacent lives, the way heat moves through a shared building, floor by floor, without anyone opening a door. 2 officers took Cleopatra's statement in the clinic, while a third ran the partial plate she had memorized. She gave them the intake log. She gave them the tattoo number. She gave them the dates, November, September, the pattern she had assembled from her own records in the hour before the SUV made its first pass. One of the officers, a woman with close-cropped hair and the manner of someone who has heard many things and retained the capacity to be troubled by them, photographed every page of the log without being asked to. The other made a call from the front step that lasted 11 minutes. When he came back inside, his expression had the quality of a man who has just had a suspicion he did not want confirmed. The name attached to the plate was known to them. Not wanted, not yet. The law moved at its own geological pace, and the gap between what was known and what was actionable was, as Cleopatra had understood for years from the receiving end of abandoned animals, both wide and deep, but known, connected to 2 prior complaints filed by a shelter in the Bronx and a rescue organization in Staten Island, neither of which had accumulated sufficient documentation individually to advance. Hers, added to theirs, changed the geometry of the thing. A single data point is anecdote. 3 is a pattern, and patterns have a different relationship with the law than stories do. She absorbed this information, standing at her own intake counter, with her arms folded and her face composed, and felt something she had not expected to feel, not relief, not yet, but the specific sensation of a door that has been sealed for a long time developing, for the first time, a visible seam of light around its edges. Word reached the street before the officers had finished their report. Mrs. Okonkwo from the brownstone 3 doors down appeared at the clinic door at 4:30 with a container of jollof rice large enough to feed several people, and the information that she had seen the black SUV on the block twice in the past month, and had not known it was significant until her upstairs neighbor told her what had happened. She had, she said with the precise emphasis of someone correcting a record, always found it suspicious. The container was warm. She stayed. The man from the dry cleaner on the corner, Mr. Ferreira, 60 years in the neighborhood, a person Cleopatra knew well enough to exchange weather observations with, and not much beyond, arrived 20 minutes later to say that he had footage from his exterior security camera covering the past 30 days, and that if it would be useful to anyone official, they were welcome to it. He added without particular drama, written down the plate himself the second time he saw the vehicle idling, because he had a feeling, and he had learned to trust his feelings about cars that idled. He handed a folded piece of paper to the officer still on the front step and declined an invitation to come inside, citing a pot on the stove, and returned up the block with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done a precise and useful thing. A woman Cleopatra did not recognize, young, in a yellow coat, with a toddler on her hip, knocked on the open door and said she had been the one walking the terrier that morning, the one who crossed the street. She said it directly, without preamble, with the particular courage of someone confessing something they have been carrying since it happened. She said she had thought about it all day. She asked if the dogs were all right. Her toddler, apparently indifferent to the weight of the moment, reached toward the warming box with an open hand and made a sound of uncomplicated enthusiasm. They were, Cleopatra told her, they were going to be. By 6 o'clock, there were 9 people in and immediately outside a clinic that had a legal capacity for significantly fewer. Someone had made tea using the kettle from the back room. Someone else had propped the door open despite the cold, and the warm air from inside was meeting the evening air from outside in the doorway and producing a visible mist that caught the light from the clinic's interior in a way that looked, from the street, like something illuminated from within. Jessy sat cross-legged on the floor beside the warming box with both puppies in her lap. They had been assessed, fed, and deemed stable enough for brief, supervised contact, and was explaining something to them in a low, earnest voice that no one could quite hear, but that everyone in the room could feel, the way you feel music through a floor. Mandy watched from the table, still and warm and present. The legal system would take the time it took. The plate would be run through the appropriate channels. The documentation would be filed and cross-referenced and added to a case that would proceed at the pace of institutions, which was not the pace of urgency, but was, eventually, the pace of consequence. Cleopatra understood this. She had no illusions about swift justice or clean resolutions. She was a widowed veterinarian who had spent 3 years learning exactly how much of the world's repair work was done quietly, in small rooms, by people who had no particular authority except the willingness to keep showing up. But there was something happening in this room that the legal system could not account for and did not need to, something that had been set in motion not by a report or a photograph or a partial plate number, but by a 7-year-old girl who had knelt in the snow on a Saturday morning and refused, with her entire small body, to walk past. The people who had walked past that morning were here now. They had come back. That was the thing, they had come back. Not because they were required to, not because anyone had organized them or shamed them into it, but because the story of a child who stayed had made their own leaving feel like something they needed to answer for, and the only answer available was presence. They had walked past and then they had turned around, and that turning, late, imperfect, unsolicited, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the essential movement. The one without which everything else remained theoretical. The bystander effect, the documented psychological tendency for individuals to withhold help when others are also present, each assuming someone else will act, is one of the most reliably observed phenomena in human behavior. It is not a moral failing unique to bad people. It is a default that requires active interruption. The interruption in this story was a child. In your story, it might be something much smaller, a comment, a share, a phone call, a decision to turn around. Communities do not awaken all at once. They awaken one person at a time, each one moved by whoever moved first. 3 weeks later, the puppies discovered the tennis ball. It had been sitting in the corner of the clinic's back room for longer than Cleopatra could accurately account for, a relic of some previous patient, slightly deflated, the felt worn to a pale fuzz on one side. One of the puppies found it on a Tuesday morning while Jessy was at school. Nudging it with his nose until it rolled a few inches across the linoleum, then startling backward at the movement with a full-body flinch that resolved, after approximately 2 seconds of recalibration, into the crouched, trembling, wholly committed posture of a creature that has just discovered the purpose it was built for. He pounced, missed, pounced again. Made contact this time and sent it skittering under the cabinet, which produced a crisis of a completely different kind, and Cleopatra found herself on her hands and knees retrieving a tennis ball from beneath a storage unit on a Tuesday morning and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, something she recognized as joy. Not the careful, rationed contentment she had been practicing for 3 years, the disciplined management of small pleasures, kept small so that losing them would not undo her. Actual joy, the uncalculated kind, arriving without appointment and without asking whether she had the reserves for it. She sat back on her heels and held the ball and watched the puppy watching her with the absolute luminous attention of the very young who have not yet learned to disguise how much they want things. And she thought about Tobena, which she always did when something beautiful happened. Not with the old weight, or not only with it, but with something that had been quietly changing its nature over these particular weeks into something she did not have an exact word for yet. Something that felt like continuation rather than absence, like the difference between a door that has been closed and a door that has been left open so the light from one room can reach the next. Mandy was on her bed in the corner. She was not the same dog that had arrived on the intake table 3 weeks ago, and the transformation was not dramatic in the way stories sometimes require transformation to be no single morning of obvious recovery, no visible before and after. It had happened the way genuine healing happens, which is incrementally and unevenly and sometimes backward before it was forward again. There had been difficult days. There had been a 48-hour period in the first week when Cleopatra had stayed at the clinic through the night, monitoring, adjusting, doing the quiet, unglamorous work that medicine mostly consists of. But today, Mandy's coat held a faint, returning luster. The vertebrae that had been prominent beneath her skin had softened under the first layers of restored muscle. She was eating fully, sleeping deeply, and had developed a precise and unsentimental opinion about which spot on the clinic floor received the best afternoon light. An opinion she enforced with the calm authority of a dog who has decided, at last, that she is allowed to take up space. When Jessy came through the door that afternoon, the puppies went to her with the full, unguarded velocity of creatures for whom she had become synonymous with good things, and she went down to the floor to receive them with the same totality, her laughter filling the back room with a sound that was too large for the space and not large enough for what it contained. Mandy lifted her head, watched, and set it back down with the settled satisfaction of a mother whose children are accounted for and whose world has contracted, in the best possible way, to exactly the size of this room. Cleopatra stood in the doorway between the front clinic and the back room and watched her daughter and the dogs with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things she wanted to remember accurately. Not the idealized version, not the story version, but the actual one, with the linoleum that needed replacing and the overhead light that buzzed slightly and the tennis ball still slightly damp from its adventure under the cabinet. She wanted to remember it exactly as it was. Ordinary. Warm. Hers. The case was moving. Slowly, as she had known it would. The documentation had been formally combined with the existing complaints from the Bronx and Staten Island shelters and assigned to an investigator whose caseload was long and whose resources were finite, but who had called Cleopatra twice to ask follow-up questions with the focused attention of someone building something carefully. Mr. Ferreira's camera footage had proven useful in ways she had not been told the specifics of, which she took as a reasonable sign. There would be no swift resolution, no clean ending delivered on a schedule. There would be process, imperfect, incremental human process, and she had made her peace with that because the alternative to imperfect process was no process at all, and she had seen enough of what no process produced. What had already been transformed could not be untransformed. That was the thing she found herself returning to in the quiet moments, the late evenings after Jessy was asleep, the early mornings before the first appointments arrived. Mandy was here. The puppies were here. The people who had come back, who had turned around and returned, were still here in the ways that mattered. Mr. Ferreira, who now raised one hand every morning when she opened the clinic. Mrs. Okonkwo, who had begun sending her eldest daughter over on Tuesdays with a covered plate that Cleopatra accepted with less resistance each week. The woman in the yellow coat had called to ask about adoption processes for the puppies and had used the word we, meaning herself and her toddler, and the conversation had lasted 20 minutes. A 7-year-old girl had knelt in the snow and refused to leave, and the refusal had moved outward from that single point like a change in temperature, gradually, by degrees, through every adjacent thing. Kindness is discussed, often as though it were feeling, something that arrives when circumstances permit and retreats when they become inconvenient, a pleasant weather condition dependent on the larger climate. But what Jessy had demonstrated on that sidewalk, and what Cleopatra had chosen at the cage, and what Mandy had enacted in front of a locked door, was not a feeling. It was a decision made against the available evidence. It was an act performed without guarantee of return. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a rebellion, quiet, unglamorous, conducted on a cold sidewalk with wool gloves and a rusted cage, and 11 blocks walked through thickening snow, against a world that had decided these lives were not worth the stopping. Rebellions of that kind do not announce themselves. They do not require an audience, though they often create one. They begin with a single person who simply refuses to accept that the cold is the final word on any living thing. Jessy looked up from the floor where she was surrounded by dogs and caught her mother's eye across the room. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The expression on her face, unguarded, complete, lit from somewhere interior, said the thing that mattered, which was simply, we did something real. They absolutely had. Every story of rescue begins with a single refusal, a refusal to normalize cruelty, to accept indifference as the reasonable response to suffering, to keep walking because someone else might stop. You do not need resources or authority or a perfect plan. You need only the willingness to be the person who does not walk past. If this story moved you, don't let that movement stop here. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a chance to stand with the voiceless. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that goodness, chosen deliberately in a cold world, is not weakness. It is the most radical thing there is.